30% rebound in just a few days. That's what Bitcoin has treated us to in recent weeks. So let's check out what might be worth knowing. There were a lot of questions for today's Q&A, so we'll answer them together today. I think we'll go through over 20 of them. They will mainly concern topics such as the situation with Ethereum. What's happening with XRP? What potential does it have? What's up with Bitcoin? Is it worth continuing to accumulate it? Is it already in a bear market? At what levels might I sell it this year? What about altcoins? And what happens if there isn't an alt season? And we'll cover a lot of topics directly related to how to start investing and what to do if you're just making your first million. So I invite you to watch if you like this format and appreciate these honest, unprecedented answers. Then leave a subscription and a thumbs up. I would be obliged. You help grow the channel this way. Mark, my question is as follows. What might the future bear market in Bitcoin look like? To what levels might it drop? And how can one catch that moment to positively average the price and enter at a good time? So first of all, I won't directly predict to what level Bitcoin will fall in a bear market, but I just want to react and operate in such a way that I will look directly at what the on-chain data or other metrics I use are showing. I'll adapt a bit to the market, right? So I realize that I won't pinpoint the perfect bottom. Maybe it worked out in this cycle, and I know it sounds like bragging, but you know what the situation was with that $15,500? That turned out great, but I don't assume it will work out a second time, because the probability is slim that it will. The first thing we need to do is look at what levels we'll be dropping from. If, for example, we're at $180,000. Yes, let's assume, and in previous cycles, Bitcoin dropped by over 80%, 77, something like that recently. We can assume it will flatten out a bit, considering institutions, various companies, large entities, market maturity, greater predictability, and less impact from policy regulations. Of course, it still occurs, but not as much. Simply flattening corrections along the way, I assume that the decline in Bitcoin could be between 55 and 70% during this bearish year if we continue with the cyclicality, which would mean that, for example, from the fourth quarter of this year, we would start the declines until the third or fourth quarter of next year. Even taking into account a slight shift in timing here, let's assume 2 or 3 months if the cyclicality can indeed be adjusted by that much. And then, if we drop from $180,000 by 60%, we indeed end up with a result of approximately $72,000 or maybe $80,000. So it would be a value that is obviously below the current one. So I would really want to buy as many Bitcoins as possible. But as I said, we will also be looking at the RSI. We will also be looking at how the Bollinger Bands appear on the weekly chart. We will check the MVRV, sentiment, and individual metrics that simply make me see signs and illusions that the bear market is ending and that it might be worth buying Bitcoin. So I'm not going anywhere after this bull market, if you want to call it that, because I believe we are still in a bull market, and I will simply be here with you as well, just like I was in the previous cycle and the one before that. So I invite you to follow along, because we will be going through all of this together. Yerrick asks, how much more can Ethereum drop from now, and what levels are best to trigger leverage? For example, 3 times on Ether? Let's start with the fact that I have already been building a position here. I must admit that it hasn't taken off yet, and isn't at much higher levels, because my entry is around $1,600 and some change, averaged from 3 entries, I believe. So I still think that despite the small gain on this position, it can be built upon and you can join in, so to speak, in the fun. And well, obviously, it's your decision. It's your money. I don't know what your situation is. I generally advise against leverage for people who are just trying it out, especially at such a critically important moment like now, where you can lose capital needed for further playing out the cycle while we're still rebuilding our portfolio. And we wouldn't want to lose even more funds now or lose those that aren't in the negative, but are just being used to capitalize our portfolio. So, I believe that playing with leverage here carries a certain risk. But regarding the drop of Ether itself, I would like to refer to the fact that, it dropped over 65%, right? From those 400. I'll double check to be sure, but quickly calculating from memory, that's roughly what it came out to. Yes, about 67%, more or less. So the situation is that this drop, when we're betting that the bull market isn't over, is already very significant. So I assume that this could have been the bottom for Ethereum. Now, as I mentioned in yesterday's update on ZPP and the arena, I believe that, currently, we can generally reach levels of around $84,000 to $86,000 for Bitcoin if this roughly 10% correction materializes, and that's it. Then, in my opinion, we will continue to rise, so Ether could also potentially drop to around $1,600 with a bit more during this small pullback, which should occur a few weeks after this dead cross, once the initial increases have materialized. That's why I personally believe that waiting for much lower levels is not advisable, but also remember not to invest too much in these longs. I have the most in long positions, generally on Bitcoin, on the spot market. In terms of leverage, I currently have 12% of my entire crypto portfolio, including all the orders I have set up. So I wouldn't try to forcefully expand and ramp it up, just because of leverage, or because Ether is low, since you never know what might happen. As I said, this is a scenario considering that we will continue to grow, not a scenario assuming the end of the bull market, which is less likely, but still in play. Sebastian writes, Merrick, a question for the Q&A that has always intrigued me. What kind of capital inflow do you expect? Because it's not just you mentioning those crypto YouTubers from the so-called street. In past cycles, their influx was crucial. We're talking about new people in the market for a strong bull market surge. But now, with the current market cap, are these people able to change anything? That's the question. And even with 100 million new people, right, Sebastian, who are putting in some amount, he speculated, will their impact be significant? But not crazy, as he's very curious about it. Well, generally it's an interesting thought because indeed, over time, as the market becomes more mature, there's more money in it, and we're dealing with higher amounts. The market cap grows. The situation is such that this influx, let's say, of capital from the general public doesn't make a significant nominal difference, right? These are amounts that are often absorbed by the market, unnoticed. One whale can release 1,000 bitcoins, and that corresponds, for example, to the purchases of smaller players over an entire week. But mainly, it's not just about the amounts these people are investing, but about the whole atmosphere and trend that starts to take place. Also, the influence of people who generate demand in the crypto market when a bull market starts, and there's a big ride and rally that we're always waiting for. Because there have already been two, but we're still waiting for the final one. Hopefully a sharp surge, in the positive sense of the word. And these people are leading the way for the entire market, right? So, everyone else will also see that even if it's small amounts, people are starting to buy Bitcoin in mass, which also drives larger volumes, from others who simply expect that they will be able to, let's call it in quotes, dump the bag on the heads of the next wave of these smaller players. Because that's kind of how it looks and works in the crypto market and investments in general. It's about timing and sensing the right moment. So maybe I hinted around a bit here, but in my opinion, accurately, given the fact that it's impossible to calculate. But what really matters is how the capital flow actually looks and where these funds are going, whether they are going directly into crypto or Bitcoin, which also boosts the mood, not just adding more zeros after the decimal point. Rodek, I believe, is asking if you think, Merrick, it's worth getting into XRP with leverage right now? So let's start with the fact that if you're asking whether it's worth getting in with leverage, you probably don't have much experience or familiarity with it. So even if you enter this position and something happens, you'll probably exit it at an unfavorable moment. That's one. Two, is it worth using leverage? You know what my approach is. I usually set up orders in such a way that I create protective orders. I don't play with daily leverage on short time frames. I use it over a period of a few weeks to a few months, some more medium term, even long term. As far as leverage is concerned, I would say, I know that the funding rate eats away a bit, and there are these fluctuations, but I have a good enough cash flow and capital protection, and I stick to the values I invest in these longs. So if something goes wrong, I add 3 or 4 times. The orders lower or larger. The leverage is 2 to 4 times, usually just 2 times on altcoins recently, which means that even some corrections can't knock me off the board. Plus, I only start longs on larger positions with higher market caps, where I know these projects are likely to get back in the game, and I also have several of these longs running in parallel. So, the answer is that if XRP were to disappear from the board for some reason, you'd be in a tough spot. But if you have several projects, they can compensate for the losses from that one. You might earn less if the others don't gain as much, but it's simply much more likely. And that's what we bet on in the market, and the chance that you'll succeed is simply higher. Additionally, as the cherry on top, I'll add that I don't buy XRP above $1.50, and I've mentioned this. I sold at $2.62, and that's it. I could have bought back at $1.90, $2.10, $2.20. I don't do that, even though it's still below my entry, because if it doesn't drop below $1.50, I don't buy it, and that's it. That's what I decided. There's no rush. I probably just won't have it because it likely won't drop, and that's it. Kuba asks, how do you predict the price of XRP by the end of this year? Wait, I'll close my eyes. I'm taking it here. $500. That's what comes to mind. And seriously? Well, I generally believe that XRP has a bright future ahead. A lot depends on positive, further information regarding the case with the SEC and whether it will definitively end for good, and if the negative media coverage will disappear altogether. Additionally, the situation is such that many people assume XRP will grow significantly, right? I have plenty of those comments. This doesn't really convince me positively that there will be any massive increases. Because when I invested in XRP, twice at 59 cents, in the 23rd and 24th year, it was a joke. People were saying that XRP is dead, that nothing would come of it. I sold at over 330% profit. That was my position at the time. It was a large position that I held for a long period. And, generally, I believe that only when everyone jumped on XRP at $2 or $3, it didn't bode well. And some of those comments are brutal. So, let's say the fan base, nothing personal, really everyone can have their own opinion. But the fan base as an average here Let's say the stereotype behind the project. Well, it's SOSO. I would say, when it comes to the number of holders, sometimes just one strong negative news is enough for these people to sell off. Even though they believe in this project and will want to buy it back, they will be afraid that it might drop too much. Because XRP has this characteristic that it is often unpegged from the market, separated, living its own life. And sometimes it happened that Bitcoin was stagnant or falling while XRP was rising. And usually this is a very interesting moment because XRP often foreshadows or somehow front-runs the information that, for example, hasn't yet reached the media and only later it turns out that something happened. And XRP is already reacting to it. So here I must admit a bit of truth. That interesting people might be behind it, and there might be notable names involved in building and creating, let's say, the processing of the entire system and thematic environment, because they have access to information that the average person definitely doesn't have, which is illustrated by the stable price in the strangest moments, which simply fluctuates. Often, it's just hard to determine at first glance what, how, and why, and where the increases or decreases in this project come from. So I believe that $5.7 by the end of a year is quite possible. 10 is also in play. But what needs to happen? When exactly this might happen this year? I described in a video, which I pinned in the top right corner. It's on my channel, where I recorded an entire dedicated video about XRP, so if anyone hasn't seen it yet, with the price scenarios, what might happen and why, I will only invite you to watch it. Is it worth buying more crypto or precious metals at current prices, or should we wait for further declines? Well, that's a bit of a market paradigm due to the fact that usually when we wait for further declines, even when those declines happen, we think to ourselves, okay, it'll drop once more, then I'll buy, then I'll step out of the chamber and start investing real money. And this leads to a kind of decision paralysis. It's like a never-ending story where we just watch, observe, but don't take any active steps. So my approach is that you can start at any moment at the first available correction. Right now, there's such a correction happening in crypto. We're coming out of it a bit, but we're still lower than the all-time high in January, and definitely lower on most projects, where paradoxically, we should be greedy to buy them now, not afraid. Especially those larger, interesting projects that can catch up in price and surpass the all-time high. But when it comes to precious metals, I would treat it very long-term. Because I don't buy precious metals purely for speculation, but rather as a safeguard against crises, wars, recessions, in case of a need to potentially flee abroad, in case of illness, unemployment, or the need to help family. Those are the 7 main reasons, right? And then the 8th reason, you might say, is as a precaution against having to buy back from Russian hands or any others. Of course, knock on wood. But the point is, you know the history and how gold was often needed. So first of all, even if you're buying gold in the form of ETFs, you still need to have some of it physically because it's a very important aspect of owning gold to be able to physically do something with it and, in case of any need, take a bit of it and go out into the world with it or liquidate it in one way or another. Gold, regardless of the price, is worth buying every month in my opinion. Never all at once. Never get caught up in FOMO like now, thinking it's $3,500 per ounce. But I was foolish for not buying gold. I take it, right? And then you see a correction the next day. It was 6%, I think, or in 2 days. Gold dropped to 3,300, for example. So I assume that such thoughtless actions lead to nothing good except frustration. That's why if we buy precious metals, we assume we're buying them for years. We accumulate, gather, we don't need this money, and we buy more for similar amounts, regularly during small local dips, which in the long term makes it really hard to lose on this. But if you buy impulsively and lose 10%, you'll decide it's not for you. That's a huge mistake and extreme irresponsibility. And when it comes to crypto, as I said, as long as the cycle continues, and for now it does and is expected to last a few more months, buying more, especially during dips, isn't a bad thing. You just need to have an exit strategy and a plan for selling those cryptocurrencies, which will also be discussed in this video. Here's a Kamanoni. Asks if, in your subjective opinion, Dogecoin is capable of multiplying several times over this year. Well, personally, I believe there's a very high chance of that. A lot depends on Musk. If his companies regain favor, he will have the space and motivation to take action here. And also if Trump gives the green light to crypto and implements various proposals, then Doge for $1 is still in play. I believe there's definitely a chance for that. We're several times away from the all-time high, several 100%, so I think there's something to return to. It's still the biggest meme coin. And when the appetite for these risky assets returns, sooner or later, Doge should also rise a bit and lift the meme market up. Do you see a real chance for the legendary banana zone to occur in this cycle? And the banana zone is, you know, that kind of chart that probably everyone wants to have and dreams about, which is, you know, a green upward curving banana and then a spike, the so-called God candle, and a surge, you know, rockets flying, and so on. And for that to happen, people need to start believing in crypto again and stop being upset with it. For example, because most people have turned their backs on this market. That's the truth. They decided it's not for them, that it's some kind of scam, that even Trump tricked us with the Trump baron is here. So, due to such events, it's hard to say, oh now, we're buying altcoins from the banana zone cycle. Well, apparently people have burned out for now. So if there are indications that crypto will be able to stay stable for a few months, Bitcoin breaks the all-time high, Ether returns to around $3,500, then I believe it will be worth investing heavily in altcoins, because it will indicate that sooner or later dominance will drop significantly, and we'll have a street rally when the media starts buzzing again. When we get closer to the bull market, the end, when only a few months remain until the end, there will be a short time, people will want to earn reactively. They'll be looking for those outs. A lot will start happening again, so then, by all means. For now, in April, I don't think so. First, Bitcoin needs to break the ADH. It needs to stabilize, and then the banana zone and the rest of the alts should also have room for growth. Cruzicio here asks if the bull market has returned, or is it just a bull trap, and we're actually entering a bear market? As I said, and I'll reiterate it once more, personally, I believe that we have a small correction ahead of us, which started at $94,500 for Bitcoin. I assume that we will drop to around 88,000, and then we will slowly, but surely, rebuild towards easily surpassing 100,000, and then where we will heat up the atmosphere to go to 110 again. So, no, in my opinion, we are not entering a bear market. A lot also depends on how the American stock market holds up. If we unfortunately break through those infamous values of 4,800 points and drop lower, which would cause a more than 22% decline, then it could seriously be a problem. But as long as that doesn't happen, as long as the S&P is now 8 nice points higher, around 5,200 points with a bit more, we're still fighting to maintain these levels. And there's no talk of a bear market, despite the fact that technically on the American market, after a 20% drop, a bear market was hypothetically present. But as I mentioned in the update on ZPP and Arena, which was published last night, there were 2 such events in the past that were such a large correction. They happened, but we bounced back from those values. And a long-term bear market didn't occur at all, so 3rd time's the charm, and it will be similar now. All right, Mark, with declines, DCA is obvious. But what about during increases? How to realize profits? Good question, conscious and cool. Here, I respond like GPT chat always does when I ask it something. It says, oh great, you're super smart for thinking about that. Cool question. Great that you're so aware. But seriously, it's a good question because it's better now than when it's too late. That's why I personally believe there's also something like partially selling your positions. I also won't be selling everything at once, although I did sell Dogecoin and XRP all at once because I had a feeling we were at a high. That's regarding most projects, most outs. First of all, I will be selling outs at different times, probably depending on how each of them is doing. So that's the first thing. The second is that I will be selling them in 2 or 3 parts. I will have sell orders set at certain levels that I want to be reached. I will probably close lawns in 2 parts as well. We'll see. But mainly it's about minimizing the risk of loss, earning a bit less, but more securely. So that's really the crux of the program. The crypto market is so tricky that you often have to be satisfied with smaller profits, consciously giving up the fact that we know we could earn more by selling all at once at some point. But we can't allow that because we aren't sure if it's the best moment or if we might miss it. So I operate under the assumption that it's better to do it in 2, 3, maybe 4 stages and accept the fact of smaller profits, but in return, have a statistically greater chance of earning, which is nice. Do you think Bitcoin can reach $200,000 by the end of this year or cycle? I've heard about such a theory. I think that's really a lot. I'm more aiming for something like 140 to 180,000, within that range. I might even start selling from 130. For example, 130, 148, 163, I don't know, 177. I'm guessing 4 such levels, for now, which would still give me a very nice profit. What about the unfortunate Ethereum? Why didn't Ether rise to 3,000 when Bitcoin was at 94,000? It looks bad. Well, we have this tendency, where Bitcoin has simply turned out to be a safe haven. Yes, it's actually an asset that performs above average. It's compared to gold. And hypothetically, it could be that even if Bitcoin hadn't taken off on its own, Ether would have still dropped. It's not directly, because of this pair, that Ether is constantly weakening against Bitcoin, but rather the fact that Bitcoin is doing so well and Ether looks pale in comparison. And perhaps at this stage of the cycle, even if Bitcoin wasn't collecting a lot of accolades, Ether wouldn't necessarily look much better, right? So, mainly what I mean is that, sooner or later, when the appetite for these risky assets, for these altcoins, and various related topics returns, then indeed, Ether should perform very well, and it should be okay. But at the moment, we have a situation where everyone has simply lost faith, and there's no source for that faith to return from because everyone has capitulated from the market. There aren't any new people yet who, when they enter the market, will see, okay, maybe Ether is relatively cheap. The chart looks somewhat decent. It used to cost more. I'll take it. They won't know all the struggles we've had to face. And then indeed there will be new blood, new entrants, which will cause Ether to start pumping. The old people will return to it, and something like that will happen. It has happened before, and it might happen in the future, that Ether will double in 2 weeks or a month. It could very well be. And I always assume that such a situation could occur in this cycle. It just needs a few things to align and work together, both only and as much as that. Of course, it's wishful thinking, and a lot of things need to align together. But the truth is that it doesn't take that much for it to happen. And often, in the year following the halving, each of these necessary things has occurred. So here, a reduction in interest rates, TQE, a decrease in inflation. In the USA, and Bitcoin giving up dominance and ending its rally. New investors in the market. In mass media, so that there is a lot of buzz about crypto. For the narrative to return. For the S&P 500 to rebound. For the Nasdaq to bounce back. For trade wars to end. And for the political situation in the world to stabilize a bit. So, 10 key things need to influence the market, and then indeed Ether will grow, and we're not that far from all of them. If we go through my past analyses and read them, when these factors align, things might still turn out well. I wouldn't completely write it off just yet. I still hold about 1/3 of my portfolio in spot around the entry point now, which has caused a slight decrease in the portfolio's value due to Bitcoin, which was driving everything. But I'm still waiting. It's not bad. Piotrek asks, if you were starting from scratch today, had nothing, what would you focus on to earn 1 million? Probably zlotys. Well, first of all, I would really carve out a space for myself in some niche. I know it seems mundane and trivial to hear, but that's the truth. I would focus on simply earning as much money as possible at the beginning, rather than trying to invest from some small surpluses. If you want to make money, and if it's not inconvenient for you, you need to start earning money in real life. To earn 1 million, as quickly as possible, within a few years, let's say, it's a matter of earning several tens of thousands of zlotys monthly, and saving at least 50% of what we earn. With 40 or 30,000, you can save 60 or 70%, that's the truth. So if you have an average career that you develop from earning 5,000 at a full-time job, then you have a business alongside your job, running it, at break-even, for 1 year, saving nothing, the second year, the third. You have 10, 15, 20-something, 30-something, 40,000. Let's assume, if your business succeeds, then on average you have saved, for example, 100,000 zlotys each year. In 4 years you save 300 for 100,000. You triple it. I know it's not that easy in 4 years, but it's definitely possible in the crypto market, if you even play Bitcoin correctly. And you have that bubble, but to play it all out, and for it to happen, you need to have something to invest with. So I assume that until you earn at least 2 average national salaries, just focusing on investments purely out of convenience, because we don't want to change our lives, in terms of income or simply, I don't know, changing industries, or trying out a different company. I know it's not easy, especially at an older age when you have obligations, but that's the brutal, honest truth. Then, it will be much harder for you. You can dream about that million, while saving 500, 1,000, or even 2,000 zlotys a month. It won't happen quickly. And the last question for today, Maximilian asks if I consider a scenario where there won't be an alt season in this bull market. You always have to allow for that possibility, right? It's not without reason that I currently have 18% in altcoins when it comes to spot investments. More or less, right? Along with leveraged orders, I have 12%, of which about 6% is in Bitcoin and Ether. So let's say I have 24% in alts on spot and leverage combined. So even if everything got wiped out, if Bitcoin were to rise to $120,000, $130,000, it would still lead in my portfolio. Even if altcoins went to the ground, I would still come out above zero and be at a nice profit from the entire cycle. Even if Ether were at zero. So I'm not worried about that here. At most I'll earn less, not that altcoins have to grow, where there has to be an alt season, for me to make any profit from crypto. That's not what these investments are about. It's not about playing the entire cycle. And secondly, crypto doesn't form the core of my entire wealth. I bet that if you summed everything up, I have significantly more in real estate, for example, than in crypto itself. Because, being here, I see how volatile this market is. How it just swings back and forth. What potentially happens with it. And I just wouldn't want to be in a situation where, suddenly, cryptocurrencies crash, a 70% correction happens, we enter a bear market. And, from being relatively wealthy, I drop to a low level and still have some obligations that I can't pay off. No, so I prefer to earn less, even though I expect this bull market to continue. But I just live peacefully, and then I can hold those altcoins and other cryptocurrencies longer. Because they don't demand anything. I have enough to live on. I have other businesses, projects, investments, and it all complements each other in some way. And I'm not solely dependent on what happens with crypto. So I am definitely considering such a scenario. It might be that way, There doesn't always have to be an alt season from cycle to cycle, and the alt season already temporarily occurred twice last year, because when we have above 75 altcoins out of 100 on this chart in front of you, which over a month to 3 months, depending on how you look at it, and which metric in which school, perform better than Bitcoin from the top 100, then we have an alt season, right? For example, at the turn of November and December, such a situation occurred for almost 2 weeks or a week and a half. I said at the time that, in my opinion, it wouldn't last long, so you need to cash out. Many people accused me of doing it wrong, saying it was foolish to realize profits, when there was supposed to be a bull market and a banana zone. But, in my opinion, it's worth doing, and not listening to everyone around, because it's your money, and you should manage it well. So if you like the video, subscribe, give it a thumbs up, so goodbye, and see you in the next video.